Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to remind you that my book, Drummers on Drumming, is available now on Amazon as both a paperback and an ebook. Based on the Big Fat Five segment of this podcast, where I sit down with my favorite drummers to discuss the 5 records and stories that shaped their approach to the instrument, this book is packed with insights from the drummers who redefined how we think about the modern drum set. You can grab your copy now by checking the link in this episode's show notes or simply searching Drummers on Drumming on Amazon. So thank you for all the support, and now let's get into the show. Hello. Welcome back to Big Fat Five, a podcast financially supported by Big Fat Snare Drum and a proud member of the Drum Click Podcast Network. You can find out more about both of these at bigfatsnaredrum.com and thedrumclick.com. Anyways, this week's guest is Mark Stepro. Mark is the epitome of an LA-based working drummer with a resume that includes recording and/or performing with the Wallflowers, Ben Kweller, Brett Dennen, Keith Urban, Dwight Yoakam, John Prine, Butch Walker, Leon Bridges. It continues, believe me. Mark has an infectious energy, and we actually shared lockouts across the hall from each other in LA for about a year. We didn't even realize it. I just remember hearing this great drummer on the other side of the door that kept reminding me I need to work on my feel. So thanks for that, Mark. In this episode, we start off with a walk down memory lane before hopping into Mark's top 5 influences that made him into the drummer he is today. Cheers.
Why did that train derail? 201 victims were killed. Was my twin among the dead? Was my twin expected to live? I was here at home.
All right, so I do want to start off with an apology to my listeners from my little soapbox that I'm apparently always on. I have a tendency to rant and rave and talk down to all the chocolatey stuff that we as drummers work on in the practice room, and I more so champion choices over all that. And so, Mark, I was reading an interview with you, and you were basically saying how you're okay with working on that stuff because it's fun and it's objectively beneficial. You said it way better than I am, but you convinced me. My head is officially out of my butt.
It's funny. Can I interject?
Please do. Yes.
I was in preparation for this interview. I was listening to some Big Fat Five episodes. One with that dude Adam Willard, who I love.
Oh yeah,
I loved his picks with the Oingo Boingo and the Devo stuff. We can talk about Devo forever because I'm from Ohio.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, my point is like I actually flagged mentally. You got on that rant like twice, and it's well thought out. I understand the point that you're making. And the point that you were making seemed to be, not to speak for you, but you were basically saying I'm shedding out of this sort of fear that at some point I'll be asked to execute something that I won't be able to execute, and I'll look like a dummy.
Yep.
And so as a result, I want to have all this stuff in the bag, like just in case. But ultimately, it's kind of a waste of time because who am I kidding? Nobody ever asked me to do X, Y, or Z anyway, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Here's where I'll push back to you on that.
Please.
I think that time spent is incredibly valuable, and let's use the example of Vinnie Colaiuta on the tune Fields of Gold by Sting, and let's sort of filter our understanding through the concept of well, you're an audio engineer, so like gain structure, like headroom, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Steve Gould, who you may have had on your pod, he's got this wonderful analogy for this, and he calls it the mental dollar. Okay. And what that means is it just refers to like bandwidth, right? So like how much is being asked of you when you're tasked with, pattern X or whatever. So when you play a rock beat, a basic rock beat, Ben, I'm assuming that's not taking a ton out of your mental dollar. It's just, that's like 5 cents, 10 cents, whatever. You're thinking about whatever you have to do later that day. It's not monopolized. You're not like maxing out or whatever.
Sure.
So if you think about, there are certain drummers that, you hear play and they are playing that sort of basic beat, and I'm not trying to talk trash on anybody, but just as an assessment of somebody's facility on the instrument, you can kind of tell like, oh, dang, that guy's getting pretty close to the edge of like, he's about to like, don't make any false moves because we're about to go off the rails here. Mm-hmm. And you could picture like a beat up old car on the 110 freeway, and it's like this. But if you had a Maserati doing 60 miles an hour, it doesn't feel like it's doing 60 miles an hour because it can do 200 miles an hour, right? So when you're compiling all that information and all that shedding that you may think is kind of worthless, just think about how easy that rock beat is going to be, because you've sort of trained your mind and your feel to be so much deeper and so much more capable and competent. That rock beat that the producer is actually asking you to do is just going to feel like $1 million. So when Vinny is playing that beat that I could probably show to my wife, and I could probably get my wife to go doom tat doom tat doom. Yeah. But he's playing it and it's weighted, WEIGHTED, weighted down by all the wisdom and all the knowledge and all the facility he has. It's like just watching, LeBron James just do a layup or something, you know what I mean? So it's important, I think, for me, it's important to just have those muscles there. You don't need to use them, but it's better to have them and not use them.
Yeah, and it's I get so self-conscious sometimes saying anything in any interview on the podcast, because when you're casually talking to your friends, you can have an opinion and it can morph, and then it morphs. But I'll listen back to episodes I did 9 months ago, and I had an opinion, and it's not the same opinion, but it's just it's like there forever now. So I did want to take this opportunity to be like, guys, I'm sorry, guys and girls. Mark's perspective on this is the correct one, and it's now my perspective. So thank you.
You're welcome. Well, it's interesting that you would say that. First of all, it takes a big person to admit, like, not admit that anybody was wrong or anything, but just like, yeah, wow, I thought about that. A different perspective sort of entered my consciousness. I chewed it around, and now I feel differently. That's just being a grown-up. That's just being an adult. Like, that's impressive. That's what more people should do that.
Well, the one thing I'll still say that I agree with is that, and it's a hole in my practice routine, is that I'm not, when I allow myself to do that, then that becomes 90% of my practice routine. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, how do you break down your practice routine when you have kind of not a specific gig you're doing? Because obviously right. I'm assuming you would be learning songs more often than not because you're the working drummer. But yeah, how do you break down if you just have an open 3-hour session?
Funny you would say that, because I literally do it in 3-hour sessions. And you're absolutely right to differentiate between tune learning and practice, because to me, tune learning isn't practice. I mean, you sat at the drums for those 3 hours, but I'm playing next week with a guy called Nick Freitas, who's a real wonderful songwriter who plays with Bright Eyes. And then I'm going to out west to do some gigs with an old buddy of mine named Aaron Lee Tasjan, who's a songwriter from Nashville. And both of those, I've got 17 song sets to learn. And that's an important, inarguable part of my job, is to get that stuff together. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's not practice. Now, as for the 3 hours, that would actually royally fly in the face of what somebody like Dave Elitch would say, because his method just happens to be like, why do you care how much time it takes? You need to figure out what you want to do. And if it takes 5 minutes, then great, you're done. And if it takes 5 hours, then great, you're done. But why are you getting hung up on how long it takes? Well, for me, the answer to that question is because I don't have I just have an endless list of stuff that I'm trying to get better at. Yeah. Right. It'll take the rest of my life. So, and I also have a family. I have a son. So I take him to preschool and I go to the studio in the morning, and for 3 hours, it's work on stuff. And I can find stuff I can definitely keep myself busy for 3 hours. Like, there are plenty of things that I can keep myself busy with. And we can get into that if you want. I also already mentioned to Matt Krause just the time that I had this interesting sort of Quiplash adjacent moment in music school, which I went to for a year, where on my first lesson, the teacher was like, what do you want to learn? And I was like, I just came here for the drum lesson. I assumed you would tell me what I was supposed to learn. And his point was like, dude, you need to figure out what you want to learn.
So you said 1 year. Did you not graduate college?
No, I did. I just changed my major. I had a bunch of other, I had a bunch of other academic interests is what it came down to. And I really, really enjoyed the year that I spent in the music program, but I just had a bunch of literature and philosophy stuff that I also wanted to engage with. And going to that college, it was like a pretty high octane music program. And it was just sort of like if you've ever had any friends from high school that went on to play college sports or something, and then they go to college and you're like, oh, this is like, okay, this is all we're doing. Like I was literally advised by academic advisors. They would look at my transcript and they would go, oh, wow, you were the high school valedictorian. Look at you. Aren't you smart? And I would say, thank you. I think are you insulting me? What's going on? And they would say, well, okay, so what we mean is you've got these 3 gen ed courses that you have to take this semester. I need you to use that big brain of yours and not go to those classes and just like basically try to get a C in those classes. And because I want you like practicing like as much as humanly possible. So, and to me, that sort of contradicted the whole point of the fact that it is an all-encompassing liberal arts education. It's not MIT or PIT or whatever. Like it's a college. So I was kind of like, well, I kind of was intending on going to college. Like definitely I want to do music, but there's also like thinking stuff that I want to do. You know what I mean? So
it's like, if you want me to not go to that class, can I not pay full tuition for that class?
Yeah, there's also that for sure. Yeah.
God. Well, I did. You mentioned Matt Krause. And so you were recently on Working Drummer podcast or podcast Working Drummer. And it's a great interview. So guys, please go check that out. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I love those guys. But I did want to start off by playing a few songs from your past. And the first one will be the song Con Man by J.P. Olson. So I'm going to play a little bit of that. And then maybe we can talk about it a little bit.
Let's dig in.
He was a con man. He was a con man. He took me to a madam. She looked me over. Got undressed, then dressed again. And she gave me a number. It was a house on the north side of Chicago. Men would wait by the stairs there down below. Picture the men calling in the night to the girls on the stairs, all dressed in white, hats and gloves. We were all con men, all of us con men.
Yeah, so that's one of the few records that I've ever actually sort of co-produced. We recorded that in Brooklyn. JP is one of my best friends of all time. He's in no way a professional musician, but he's my favorite living songwriter.
Awesome.
He's an absolute brilliant mind, and he's one of the most important people in my life. And he makes his living. He's a professional journalist. He was a producer on Vice News when they had the HBO show. He made a ton of docs. He has a documentary called The Narcotic Farm about a prison in Lexington, Kentucky in the 1940s that experimented on drug-addicted inmates by giving them LSD and acid to study the effects of psychotropic drugs on people, pre-FDA. Anyway, he's a brilliant filmmaker and a brilliant thinker and documentarian, author, and all this kind of stuff. And that song, Con Man, I think he was writing a piece on this woman who got sort of caught up in organized crime in Chicago, and she became a worker at a brothel in Chicago. And like I think the lyrics are just pulled right out of their conversation. And this woman saying, she took me to the madam, she looked me over, I got undressed, then dressed again, and they gave me a number. It was a house on the north side of Chicago. Men would wait by the stairs there down below. And it's just a woman telling this, really trippy story about her sort of experience. And then we set it to music. And the bass player and orchestrator on that track is Chris Morrissey, who's one of my best friends on the planet. We were in a guy called Ben Kweller's band for many, many, many years. And Aaron Lee Tasjan is the guitar player on that, who's a very successful songwriter in East Nashville, Tennessee now. And that was that recording took place in, I want to say 2007 or 8. It's really old. But it was like right when me and my friends were just having the best time of our life, living in Brooklyn, being in our early 20s, not worried about it at all, just kind of having a really, really good time and getting home super late and watching 4 gigs a night on foot in that studio that we recorded at Grand Street. We used to hang out there all the time. So I listened to that track and I'm just sort of instantly, transported back to that point in my life. And when I sent you this tune, I got to thinking about it as it applies to the sort of meta sense of like drummers sharing songs that they played on drum podcasts. And it's like, I can play for you a bunch of stuff that is a pretty good representation of like what I do, you know what I mean? Like by artists that people who listen to this podcast would know who they are. But this recording is just, it's a little bit more special because to me, that's an articulation of sort of who I am.
Sure.
More than just like, here, I did a thing and Butch, the producer, liked it and they put it on a record and this is it. Yep. You know what I mean? Like, this is more like I was inside of this music. So that's why I wanted to maybe focus. That's why I picked that particular tune.
When you were, because I've heard you tell the story of a guy that gave you drum lessons that he came in, or you went to his house because maybe there's an overflow at the music school, and he had his gig bags, and he was just a working drummer.
Totally.
From the beginning, did you always want to be? Sideman, I don't think has a negative connotation. I don't view it as that. No. But did you always want to be the sideman, the chameleon, or was your goal to be, Larry Mullen Jr.?
Never to be Larry Mullen Jr. I always wanted to play as much as humanly possible. Mm-hmm. And I was always starting bands with my friends in high school and college and all that stuff, and playing in bars when I was 14. So I come from Ohio. I come from a tiny, tiny town way, way out in the boonies. So sort of 70s classic rock radio is what they listen to there, as like that constitutes like modern music. Okay. So that it's Eagles is about the end of, you know what I mean? Like or maybe Devo or something like that. It's no music past 1980 for sure.
I'm kind of okay with that, by the way.
I'll tell you, dude, in retrospect, it ended up being a bit of a superpower.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Totally.
Being a Midwestern 70s rock dude is it's just so not cool. It'll never be in or out of fashion.
That's a good way to put it.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just totally like it's like a pea coat, I guess. You know what I mean? Like, so yeah, I was in bands, but then I got hooked up with this teacher early on, and I just sort of saw his life, and I really, honestly, I just wanted his life. And more important to me than the delineation between sideman versus Larry Mullen Jr., what's important for me to express to you is just that, like, I didn't really see myself. I just thought I was going to be the guy that played at the bar a lot, because that's kind of what he was. And he was in Columbus, Ohio, and I love Ohio. Like, I have this state flag tattooed on my arm, but you can really there's a bit of obviously like a ceiling there, and he was for sure hitting that ceiling. And so I just didn't even think I didn't even think outside of that realm. So I just thought I'll just be a guy who plays like some weddings and some, parties and some cover band gigs, and I'll have a band of my own and I'll teach at a drum store. And then that'll be a total victory to me, because this guy it is like a world-class musician, which, every city in the country's got 5 or 6 guys who are, you say you're from Seattle?
Seattle area, yeah. Chewelah, Spokane, kind of little east side.
There's easily 10 guys in Seattle who are world-class. Not, he's the best guy in Seattle, but like, no. He could be world-class in New York or London or Los Angeles or whatever.
Yep.
And this guy that I studied with in Columbus is one of those guys.
Mm-hmm. Well, we do have a lot of stuff to get to, so let's maybe move on to number 2, and that is Born a Lion by Taurus.
Yep.
All the days are numbered, all the voices low. Colder than the wall, silent as
pause, cool turnaround.
Yeah. Let's let this play.
Sure, yeah.
Can we let this play?
Of course. As long as you don't sue me. Oh, there's two drum tracks going on.
Yours a restless soul, afraid to be alone. The fear can lead to a special kind of loneliness. So know that you're forgiven, and know that love can live through evil days. And I believe my mother.
That's Chris Morrissey again, who is a bass player I was telling you about earlier, who I toured with Kweller for 6 or 7 years. He was Sarah Bareilles' band member, bass player, maybe MD for a minute. But he plays with literally that band Happy Apple and stuff like that. His best friend is Dave King. He's a total Minnesota. He plays upright bass in Mark G's quartet.
Okay, yeah.
And he plays electric bass in the Beat Music, which is Mark's other band.
Mark Juliana, by the way.
Mark Juliana, the drummer. So he kind of comes from that world, but then he wrote these really, really fun, harmonically dense songs. We were all living in Brooklyn and we were all super into Grizzly Bear at the time. And this sort of music that borrows from elements of classical composition and stuff like that. And Chris has this, deep reservoir of sort of harmonic knowledge as it relates to jazz. So he came up with this incredibly cool music. And that was the last time I was in a band where it was just here's this really cool song. You, Mark Stepro, you do you. Come up with some cool stuff and zero limits or whatever. And at the time, obviously, I was listening to a lot of what Mark G was doing in beat music, and that sort of Jojo Mayer restating human beings replaying electronic drum and bass music or whatever.
Sure.
Which is kind of where the verse to that tune comes from. And the chorus of that song goes into this big kind of halftime feel, but undergirded, there's this 30-second note marching snare. And when we would do that live, sometimes Mark and some other drummers would come up on stage, and we had this little, Chris called it a snare drum choir. We had a bunch of guys playing that sort of syncopated 30-second note part while
That's
I was
sick.
just going zoom, zoom, da,
Sure.
zoom, zoom, ba. And it was super fun. I really, really enjoyed my time in that band.
What time period was that? That was after Con Man?
Yeah, I was in that wheelhouse. I moved to New York in 2005, and I moved here to Los Angeles in 2010. So it was somewhere in there.
Okay. Yeah, I always have this. I mean, I'm 34, and in the back of my head, I want to move to New York for a year and just play some off-Broadway show and just hustle around town. And before I have kids, that I'm not sure if that'll happen, but yeah, it was always a pipe dream.
It was the 5 best years of my life. I mean, it was so fun. I wouldn't trade what I've got going on right now for anything. But I mean, that was just we somehow made the rent. We somehow didn't have a total heart attack over it, and we were all playing gigs all the time. Yeah. It was a really, really robust sort of period. And you could, like I said, you could just be on foot every night watching 5 different world-class drummers and take the subway home and go to bed at 5 a.m, which I routinely did. You know what I mean? Every night. It was so important to me in terms of development.
Mm-hmm. I did want to ask you too, because you, when it comes to Working Drummer podcast, you being on that, you are the quintessential working drummer. I think you've accomplished what was the guy's name? The teacher you wanted to discuss? Was that Ed Cobbs? Jim Ed Cobbs?
Jim Ed Cobbs, yeah. Yep.
Okay. I mean, you've achieved that. And so how do you deal with the not knowing what's coming around the corner aspect of your life? Because you've been that guy for years.
Yeah. It's funny. the guitar player in that band, Taurus, is another one of my dear friends called Rich Hinman. And he played with Sarah for years. And Rich is a wonderful guitar player. And we talk about this all the time. It really just kind of, the two sort of fundamental things that it boils down to is just like, it doesn't change, it doesn't get better, and just like try to save your money. You know what I mean? Like just try to not spend your money when you have it, so that when there are periods of time that you're not working, it's like not the end of the world. And I'm in a marriage now with somebody who's like my wife is a writer for television, and there'll be times when she works and times when she doesn't work. So it's I've just been doing this freelance thing. I worked at a drum shop in Columbus, Ohio in 2005, early 2005, saved up a couple $1,000, moved to Brooklyn. And actually, no, I moved to the Upper West Side because my girlfriend was in college at the time. But that was the last time I had like a job. And it's very unscientific, but it just kind of keeps working. And I mean, I do believe this isn't so much advice as it is just like a recitation of my own personal experience, which is just to say that like the longer you stay in the game, the more solidified your position becomes, because guys kind of quit every day, and people go to grad school and people just decide they've had enough, which is probably the smart thing to do. You know what I mean? But so, I mean, I really do believe it. It's like, I hate speaking in these platitudes because they sort of sound dumb, but it's just like, you just got to not stop. Yeah. I mean, that is so simple. I realize that, but it's just, you have to not stop. You have to be okay with having periods of time when you're not working, and you just have to hang on to your money and not spend a whole ton of money and just be sort of sensible. But I was raised by conservative Midwestern public school teacher parents. So like at no point did I ever want to go bonkers with money or anything like that. Honestly, the hardest thing in my life right now, as far as that stuff goes, as the pandemic recedes and things open up, I'm sure you're experiencing this, is like, I've got like 3 people asking about the same date, left and right, dude. And it's so stressful because it's like, I was telling my wife this morning, like, okay, out of 3 months, these 3 people picked the exact same 3 dates. You know what I mean? Like out of 90 days, it's just these 3 days that are all, and then you kind of have to like, not string people along, but you don't want to say no right out of the gate, because you say no because I'm doing this other thing. And then this other thing just miraculously disappears. And it's just a big game that you just kind of always just keep playing, I guess. And you just kind of learn as you go, I think.
I know. And then when everything fits into place, it's just like,
it's like
you don't want to, no one breathe.
I know. It's the best feeling in the world. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, so see if I can word this correctly. I'm so happy that I have you on, because you are a chameleon in the, and I say that with such admiration. And so I want to know all your inspirations, because it's not like you're in this one band where you're known for this one thing. You have to be able to pull from all these different things. So the choices you made, and we talked about how tonight you're going to wake up and be like, okay, why didn't I say this thing?
1,000%.
But the ones you did choose are things that are actually utility picks that you actually pull from having to be this drummer for so many people. So I'm really excited about that. I'm not sure if I worded that well, but I'll drop in maybe a better way to explain it post. But so I sent you some prompts, and the first one was a specific groove that completely changed the way you think about drums. And so you sent me a few for every prompt, which I love. And so it'll be like the big fat 12 today, which is awesome. You can just
pick 1 or 2. I don't want to bulldoze this conversation with
bulldoze away, man.
My boundless drumming wisdom.
Yeah. Well, I definitely am going to play this one. So the song is Cool by John Scofield off the album Groovelation. And I'm so happy when I find drummers that I don't know their name, and then I listen to them and I'm like, how have I not gone down this rabbit hole? So it's Idris Muhammad.
Yeah.
And for this song, Cool, I'm going to start it, unless you have a specific spot, maybe around 35 seconds. Great choice, by the way, man.
Yeah, that's slamming, dude. That is. You mentioned Zig when we were listening, and I mean, Idris is a New Orleans guy. He's not with us anymore, but I believe he might have he played on a lot of R&B stuff in the '60s. He might have been drummer on "That's the Sound of the Men," working on "The Chain Gang" by Sam Cooke and stuff like that. But he's also, he's pretty jazz adjacent. He's one of these New Orleans guys that's like sort of R&B, sort of jazz, sort of whatever New Orleans itself is or whatever. And I think just what's so hip about that pattern is it's not really like a linear, like Garibaldi kind of a beat where each limb only plays at one time. There's a lot of like overlap, you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of, I guess, double stops, you'd call it, like snare and kick hitting at the same time, snare and hat hitting at the same time. And all that is, it's just kick, snare, and hat for the most part, but it's just this multi-dimensional groove. It's like a MC Escher painting of a groove. You know what I mean? It's like it's very, very difficult to pin down exactly what's happening because there's so much sort of chatter and activity happening between all three of those limbs. And I just super quickly want to tie this groove to my teacher, to Jim Ed. This is like talk about Jim Edmund. Fine, I'll do it. I'll do it for the rest of my life. But so I was 14 or 13 maybe, and I wanted him to show me this like Rush thing or whatever, and meaning Neil Peart, some Rush thing, which is what you do when you're 14.
Absolutely. And
I've thought about this. I thought about this a lot today, and I want to make sure that I articulate this correctly. I'm not like worried about getting in trouble, but I just want to articulate my thought in the way that is still kind to Neil Peart. Okay.
Sure.
So I wanted to learn this Neil Peart thing. And my teacher was basically like, he was like, yeah, I can show you, but like, that's kind of whack, right? And I was sort of like, what? Like, what? No, what's whack? What are you talking about, old man? You don't know
Neil
anything.
Peart. Yeah.
Yeah. You didn't hear me. Wait, and his, he was like, yeah, okay, I'll show you some of that stuff, but like, let me show you some stuff. Cause I think we're growing up where maybe you grew up, like I had zero exposure for the most part to black music, to improvised music, and he could tell. And that was one of the reasons that I'm very grateful to him, is like he saw a deficiency in my development and found it and was like, we'll get to Neil Peart, but like, let's deal with the fact that you don't know who Bernard Purdie is. You know what I mean? And that was kind of his whole trip. And he kind of laid that stuff on me. And I think, the idea is sort of, it's like with the thing about with Neil, it's sort of the same way that like how people say that, Donald Trump is like a poor person's idea of a rich person. Like if you don't interact with wealth very much and you see a guy with a gold toilet seat, you're like, oh my God, obviously that guy, clearly that's like a very rich, successful guy, right?
Yeah.
Well, so Neil Peart's kind of aesthetic and his whole approach is very similarly very maximalist in that regard, right? I'm not in any way comparing Neil Peart to Donald Trump, but my point is, you could be a guy that delivers Amazon packages and you watch Neil Peart and you're like, oh, well, obviously that's a big time.
That's huge, the apex. Yeah.
It's total the apotheosis of like awesome drumming. And my teacher was basically trying to say like, let's just put that to the side for a minute because you have some glaring omissions in your aesthetic and in your ability to hear and understand sort of nuance and getting your listening chops together and getting your appreciation chops together. And I just thank God every day that I had that lesson when I was 13 and not 23 or 33. You know what I mean? Like he hit me with that early on. And I was just very, very fortunate to get whacked over the head with like, oh yeah, like the sun doesn't rise and set on like 70s rock drummers necessarily. You know what I mean? It was a dimension opening kind of experience. And that tune is kind of is a really good example of that.
Yeah. And I would say to piggyback off that because I'm a few years younger than you, I think, that for me, my generation, it was Travis Barker.
Yep, exactly.
And I would love to have him on. I wish I could have had Neil on. They're both icons.
Yes.
But for that same reason, I wish I would have had a little bit of that and then been able to move on quicker.
Yeah. It makes sense that a 13-year-old in the late 90s in Orange County would hear Travis and be like, that's the guy.
Yeah.
Like, I totally get that.
Totally.
And my teacher was sensitive to that. He was compassionate about that. He was like, that's a guy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, what about these other guys that you've never heard of that maybe you should? And I was like, right on, man. Let's go.
Well, and it's also and then as you get older, you can look at Bernard Purdie versus Neil on their intentions. Neil's intention was to be a third of a statement, which was Rush. Bernard and the other drummers were trying to be, not that Neil wasn't for the song, but Bernard was trying to make less of a statement as, hi, I'm Bernard Purdie, how are you doing? It was, hey, here's this song, don't look at me kind of thing in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I listened to your interview I was saying with Adam Willard, and he talked about, like, he kind of distilled Neil to his essence is really, he's a parts drummer. You know? He's a parts drummer in a way that Bernard kind of isn't, or Idris Muhammad isn't. Like, those guys aren't, I promise you, neither of those guys are going like, okay, on the and of 4, I'm going to open the hi-hat and then I'm going to do, those guys were just doing some stuff, you know what I mean? Whereas, and it was awesome, obviously, but Neil's thing was like much more thought out. I wrote this little piece for Modern Drummer when he passed, kind of trying to find the really good, inspiring part of his playing that I can still relate to as an adult, because now I'm older and I don't necessarily resonate with that music the way that I did when I was 13. And what I landed on was, I cook a little bit at home. I'm not a huge chef or anything like that, but I just like to cook. And I got to reading about that French guy. I don't even know how to pronounce his last name. I believe it's Escoffier, who was sort of the father of the modern French kitchen that influenced Anthony Bourdain. And it's all modeled after the French military. Okay. So everything is in a place, mise en place, and everything has its exact, it's the reason that when you go to a really nice restaurant, the rigatoni that you get on Monday, June 1st is exactly the same that you get on Thursday, July 9th. Like, consistency, like super duper 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 consistency.
Sure.
And that is the brilliance of Neil to me, which is to say that his performance of La Via Strangiato in Oakland in 1978 is almost identical to La Via Strangiato in Portland, Maine in 1992. It's fascinating. That's inspiring for sure.
Well, and I know you were saying that Idris doesn't think about opening the hi-hat. I was going to say, not to disagree, but to point out his thing is that in that song you just pointed out, he is kind of being a little hectic in a not distracting way, but a cool way. But he does have that. He has a few motifs within that beat
that's totally true,
that ground it. And I was going to bring it up that. Do you, I'm assuming you do. You bring that into your playing, which is like being out of the way, but also allowing yourself to have those motifs that make the audience go, okay.
Totally. I'm always trying to do what I would call like the minimum effective beat, which is just sort of like, what's the overall, so that con man beat, tunes, okay, like that's the basic bones of the beat. Like you can't really get around that. So if I'm playing on a track for a producer or something, like, okay, what is the main guy? First, step one, figure out who the main guy is. Then make sure the main guy is under control and satisfied at all times. That there's your lesson. But he wants boom, cack, totally dig it. But how close can I get to the line where I can do some stuff that's a little bit squirrely or a little bit weird, you know what I mean? That's just enough that just if somebody was really paying attention, they might go, like, whoa, what? Oh, cool, huh?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Within this overall structure of, it's, just trying to be creative within the lines, you might say.
Absolutely. Well, let's go on to the next one from this same category, so a specific groove, and it's Inconsolable.
Oh, God, play the outro of this tune, if you would.
Sure, of course, man.
Sorry, I talked over you. I got really excited.
Dude, no, I'm the host, man. So I am not here to talk as much. So
I got really excited by mid-90s Lilith Fair rock. It just really got me going.
As you should. So it's 6:53 and I'm at 5:31.
Sure,
should I go farther than that? Okay.
That seems cool.
And so you were saying you believe under good authority that's Abe Laboriel Jr.
I think that's a 22, 23-year-old Abe. I do. Yeah, maybe a little older. I talked to Jay Belleros about this. He's on that record too, but he didn't remember being on this track. Sean Pelton's on it as well, but there's something about the depth of those drums, and I don't really no symbol frequency identification. I don't know. It just sounds like Peisty vibes. I can just picture in my mind's eye Abe playing that tune. And that's another good example of 13-year-old me is asking my teacher how to show me how to play Limelight. And my teacher's like, yeah, why don't you play this super slow 6/8 thing and make it like stick? Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, joke's on you, old man. That's easy. You know what I mean? I'm like, who can't do that?
Watch
you know
this.
What I mean?
Oh, shit.
And, oops, crap. Okay, well, you know what I mean? And I still, every once in a while, I throw that tune on and just to see if I'm such a like type A. I'm just kind of a high strung, my brain is way more like Stuart Copeland, and I'm just like more like, so like that super far back 6/8 thing is like a real challenge to me. And that's like, I still work on that feel.
Well, and like you were saying that you can say, oh, I can play that. But those rolls, like going from that, that backbeat, which is, by the way, so far back, you're almost about to fall over. And then doing those rolls in between to be able to have those crazy dynamics where it just sounds like white noise. And then to go back to those really open notes. I mean, that is some of the hardest drumming, whether a 14-year-old knows it or not.
Well, so check it out. This applies directly to our earlier conversation about Headroom, because 90% of that tune is slow 6/8 grooving whatever. And then in the outro, they're like, all right, I hope you got some gas in the tank because we're going to get weird. You know what I mean? Like, I hope you can get weird with us because we're trying to get weird here. Yeah. And it would have been maybe a little bit whack if he didn't have the facility to interact with what the other musicians were doing. And if he just kind of out of limitation, right, just kind of kept it straight and was like, I don't want to try for anything that I can't, maybe I better, it's just like balls out, you know what I mean? And that's another thing that's really beautiful about that track is how expressive it is and how uninhibited it is. It's like, it's a real lesson for sure.
Yeah, in my mind's eye, I can just imagine Abe just smiling so happy when the musicians are building up. He's like, I'm right there with you guys.
Oh, I got you. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Oh my God, that hearing that dude play always makes me so happy.
Yeah.
All right, I do want to, just for the sake of time, let's do Mr. Bitterness.
Okay.
By Soul Coughing, and I'm just gonna. I mean, this is just from the top. Yeah, exactly, right off the bat.
One. Bitter Sea, and she sits and drinks a Velvet Crush, and that's Kool-Aid and gin, casing the clientele like a relentless cameraman. She is elsewhere. She says you keep a knocking but you can't come in, and I say, little sister, don't you...
Just so everyone knows, there is all the songs I play or mention on this show will be on a Spotify playlist. Just search for Big Fat Five Podcast - Mark Stepro, and it'll be all on there. It'll be in the show notes as well. But listen to all these songs. Listen to them start from finish because the drums, tell the story. So, but anyways, yeah, Mr. Bitterness.
Yeah, that's the group Soul Coughing that was kind of a downtown New York. They were kind of a late '90s. What would have been called at the time alternative rock band that eventually wound up having a major label deal. That's one of the bands that made me romanticize New York because I was reading about them in my hometown in, rural Ohio, which, had 8,000 people in it. And these guys were part of this sort of downtown scene, which involved John Laurie and the Sex Mob and Tony Shear and Kenny Wollesen. And they used to play it's when Zebulon, which was a sort of improvised music venue in Williamsburg, was really popping off. Obviously, it's, the Zebulon they got here in LA. It's on Fletcher over in Frogtown. Yeah. Moved from New York. It was, yeah. So in the 90s, dude, in the 90s, Zebulon was synonymous with sort of experimental, improvised jazz adjacent, what probably in the 90s would have been called like acid jazz type groups or whatever. Sweet. And that groove, that band Soul Coughing came out of that scene. And that groove is totally some type of 90s urban dance adjacent style that I don't even know. I don't have the language to even I don't know if that's a house beat or I don't know what you even call that. But it's interesting that it does, as per our previous conversation, the guts of it are 4 on the floor with a snare. Mm-hmm. And it's just all he's doing is moving his right hand over from the hi-hat to hit the backbeat. So the left hand is all offbeat 16th ghost notes. And it's a phrase. It's a beautiful 2-bar phrase. And it's very sort of dexterous and it's very busy. But it also comes out of that culture at the time. So I assume people actually danced to that music. So it wasn't just like some show-offy drum thing. You know what I mean? It's like club music of the time. Yeah. And I was just obsessed with it and wanted to move to New York because of it.
Yeah. It's very hypnotic, you know, it just keeps on grooving. Have you gotten a chance to meet Yuval?
I don't even know if he's in America. I don't know anything about him. He's Israeli for sure, but I don't know if he went back to Israel. I know Mike a little bit, and I know Mike, Mike despises those guys. The not Mike members of Soul Coughing. I played some gigs with Sebastian Steinberg, who's the bass player in that band. And he's a wonderful player. He plays with Fiona Apple and some other folks. But yeah, I don't know. I never caught up with that drummer Yuval, nor am I aware of what he did after that group. I'm sure he did something, but I'm not aware of it.
Yeah, well, in the research for this show, I tried to see if he's around because I was like, man, after listening to Mr. Bitterness and kind of going down that rabbit hole, I was like, it'd be cool to have Yuval on the show. And he's nowhere to be found, at least on the socials. If anyone knows, I'll be put in contact because he'd be fun to talk to.
It's true. Every groove on that Ruby Vroom record is a really fun. It's really, really fun to have those grooves in your under your hands because they're atypical and they're sort of odd and they're not normal beats for lack of a better way to express that. And it's really good it's a good shed for sure.
Well, and I know I work with artist relations, and so I probably shouldn't say this, but when I see a drummer that is obviously so talented, and I'd put you in the category of not having, like, they don't focus on their internet presence like some people do. It's like kind of respect, you know? It means you're actually out there you're living in the real world. You're living analog, and I don't not respect it, is what I'm trying to say.
You've been emailing me at a Hotmail address.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not an ironic one, you know?
Dude, this is totally random, but my first email ever was cheesyboy with a Z 69 at hotmail.com.
You couldn't get the 420 in there?
Or? That was the next one.
Was that taken?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
That's great.
All right, so next one is a God to Me, and it's the favorite Phil choice moment from a certain record, and you put Mr. Levon Helm, his drum break in Rag Mama Rag.
Just play that break, man.
We can't get together. We could be relaxing in my sleeping bag.
Yeah.
But all you wanna do for me, mama, is bang, mama.
So folks listening, if you have listened to this podcast and you haven't gone down a Levon rabbit hole, shame on you. Also, I've exhaustingly talked about him, but not this song. So please go ahead.
Well, so first of all, it occurs to me as I'm listening back to that, it's a 3-bar phrase, which is kind of weird. And I was trying to look up those lyrics because there's something that he does. Oh yeah, that's it. So if you think of that 3-bar phrase, like, let's take it apart 1 bar at a time. So that first one, that we could be relaxing, he's just kind of like, it's very Ringo, you know, sort of 70s bouncy drunk drummer dude, whatever. Mm-hmm. But then I love the second part is like, on my sleeping bag, and it's like, I feel like he might have maybe the wheels got out of control for a second, you know what I mean? Just sort of like, but then in the 3rd bar, he brings it back around and it lands right with the vocal, because then it's like, all I gotta do, me honey is, and then we're back in. And it's like that. I don't know. There was a VH1 made like one of those classic albums about that record, and I can't remember. I'd be interested, you might know since you're such a fan, like, did the vocal and the drum part go down at the same time?
Oh, I wish I knew. I mean,
I have to imagine that they did.
I would assume too. I mean, there's a lot of bleed, and the mixing of that record is like, that can't have been all overdubbed, because some of it is leaves a little bit much to be desired, if you know what I mean. But in the best possible way. Yeah.
But yeah, it just sounds like it just sounds like this one whole thing, this vocal
100%.
And what the drumming is doing and what the vocal are doing are literally just the same thing, obviously, because they're coming out of the same person. But just that third bar of the, all you gotta do, oh, my honey is rag. And then he leaves that little hole for himself, oh, my honey is rag. And then when it comes back in on rag, we're back into the groove and we're driving the train again. And it's just like a bonkers, funny drum break. It's just ridiculous in the best way. It's just so joyful and exuberant. And clearly, I mean, those guys obviously hated each other by the end, but at that moment, they were having a good time.
Yeah, by the second record, they were riding high. I do want to play that one more time, and I actually don't want to. I hope I'm not wrong. That when he goes into it, he doesn't hit a crash cymbal. He just goes into it just like closed hi-hat.
I don't know that there's a crash cymbal on this track.
Or maybe the entire record.
Yeah.
Ask about the weather. Well, I can't jump a hurdle and we can't get together. We could be relaxing in my sleeping bag. But all you want to do for me, mama, is ring, mama, ring.
Yep. Just goes right back into closed hi-hat.
Yes, he left his cymbals in Garth Hudson's car or something.
Or Robbie Robertson's like, I actually own that too.
Yeah.
All right. All right. So yeah, I mean, we could talk about Leave On Forever, but I mean, he's the epitome of, because he is, I mean, he's singing that song right there. A vocalist's drummer.
Yeah. All you need, yeah. He was, all you need to know is that, you know, Ronnie Hawkins and Robbie Robertson and all those guys, they idolized him, you know. He's the epitome of, like, he was there when rock and roll was born. He's from Arkansas.
He's the best. He's the best.
Yeah, for sure.
To quickly move on, or else I'm going to start talking about him more. Yeah. All right. So a performance, this is number 3, a performance which you either played or witnessed that altered your musical course. And I'm going to let you say it. Okay. To humble brag.
All right. I very much apologize if this is totally douchey. Like, but you did say
brag.
That you performed, so I took that as an opportunity. So all right. So my friend Drew Taubenfeld in Los Angeles. Do you know Drew Taubenfeld by chance?
I don't, unfortunately.
He's a wonderful dude. He's a music director for a bunch of artists, and him and his partner Max Bernstein have a company, and they put bands together and all this. And
I should know him.
He's they're really good. I'll tell you about him. But he was MDing the R&B artist Leon Bridges, and they had 4 dates that they needed to fill on drums because their drummer, basically Leon was between record cycles, so there was no more touring, but it was like, oh, we have a gig on July 1st, July 29th, August 10th, and September 3rd. Yeah. And for Rico Allen, the touring drummer at the time, that was bad news because he had hopped on another tour, and he was like, dude, I can't just like be available for 4 gigs in 3 months.
Going back to what we were saying earlier at the beginning.
100%. And I had my son was very young at the time, so I wasn't touring at all. And I was like, well, yeah, that sounds great. I'll totally go do that.
Sure.
And then Drew was like, yeah, one of the gigs is opening for the Rolling Stones in Amsterdam. And I was like, yeah, I think I can make it to that. I'll see if I can get there. So, you know, I don't know. It's interesting. It didn't change my musical trajectory. If I thought about that question more, just sort of like we talked about, I can think of other gigs that have been like, oh, then this happened and then this other thing happened as a result of having done this thing. Mm-hmm. This wasn't that, but it was definitely a nice little feather in my cap to show up with one rehearsal the night before the gig and then go. I've never even seen the Rolling Stones. When I grew up, when I was a kid, the band Guided by Voices from Dayton, Ohio, who had played to 400 people, that was my idea of like a famous band. So obviously I was intellectually aware that the Rolling Stones existed, but I didn't really come up out of that world. So, you know, we did that gig, and I have to say it went very, very well. And I was honestly, I can say this on your podcast because it's honest. Like I'm kind of proud of myself I did a pretty good job on that one. Sure. I've blown it many, many, many times. That time I didn't blow it, and everybody came away from it really, really happy. And I left with sort of indelible memories of a job well done. And I saved one of the €20 pieces of money that the tour manager gave us for per diems so that I can give to my son someday. If he's 21 and wants to go mess around in Europe, I can be like, here's let me tell you the story about how your old man got this 20-euro note. I'm like Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite. Back in '83, I could throw the pigskin a quarter mile. That's going to be my thing. I'm going to just be driving my family bonkers with that anecdote for the rest of my life. But it was very, very important to me, and I think about it fondly, and I thought that was an appropriate answer to your question.
No, totally. Well, speaking of going back to stories, I mean, that's kind of what you mentioned when we were talking earlier about the wine thing with me. I want to be that old guy. I could go back into the wine industry right now because I love it, but I want to be that old guy that owns a winery that just stands at the end of the bar and tells the equivalent to me, my Rolling Stone with Leon Bridges' story. And like, oh, yeah. He tells us, just humor him.
Just let him do it. Let him.
Yeah, he loves it.
Yeah.
He loves it.
I'm going to be that guy. I don't care.
All right, so a record that just hit you at the right time in your life and represents a big old piece of your artistry. So the first one was Sun Volt. The album was Trace, and I have no problem saying on this podcast, there's so much I don't know. I've never heard of Sun Volt.
Well, we're on a drum podcast, and there's little reason on a drum podcast for you to know what that band is. What I thought was important is Mark G was talking to you about Square Pusher. And he was talking about the Cuban guy that he was listening to, and how, I can't remember the Cuban guy's name, but basically how those two musics, let's use Square Pusher for an example. Like, being into that music is also part of being in that culture, which means that you lived in Bristol, England in 1988, and you wore Doc Martens and had the suspenders, and you were into like drum and bass and electronic music, and you're going to clubs and raves and stuff like that, and you ate fish and chips and Pakistani food at 3 a.m, drunk on Carling and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's part of the culture. You just described
an amazing night, by the way.
Sure, yeah.
It sounds great to me.
Or as I call it, Tuesday. But
yeah, totally.
But so this record, this band Sunvolt, was led by a guy called Jay Farrar, who had been in a band with Jeff Tweedy from Wilco called Uncle Tupelo back in the day. And Uncle Tupelo basically invented the genre that would later be referred to as alt country. They had a record called No Depression, which became a genre of music, No Depression, which is just basically like Midwestern sort of roots music, Americana, for lack of better words. But this is, we're talking about in 1993. Okay. And I was just really into that music when I was a kid, which is strange because it was sort of obscure at the time, but it was obscure. But the reason that I bring up the culture thing is because that music sounded to me exactly what my life looked like. Okay. So I would just get in my beat up 1988 Ford F-150 pickup truck, and I would drive through cornfields for an hour, past farms and farms and farms, to go visit my girlfriend in college, who was at a different college at the time. And it was just a very rural, very pastoral, very low key, very low stakes, very humble situation. And that music really, really spoke to that. And again, they always talk about how like the music that you listen to between the ages of 14 and 18 is the stuff that's going to really stick with you. And I just have like very, very visceral memories of that music being a part of my life. And, so Jay went on to form Sunvolt, and Jeff went on to start Wilco, which is another record that I'd like to talk about later, which kind of came up at a subsequent period of my life. But Trace was a very big deal for me. It's basically like, alt country was what they called it at the time.
Let's go to actually the next record. And by the way, it's Osain Del Monte was who Mark Giuliano was talking about.
Nice.
From Cuba. I did not know that off the top of my head. I had to look that up.
I'm glad you
did. So the next one, Wilco, Yankee Hotel Foxtrot.
So I was in Columbus, Ohio in college, and it was 2001, and Wilco performed on Conan O'Brien. They played the song "I'm the Man Who Loves You" from Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, and Ken Coomer was no longer in the band, and there was just this wacky drummer back there with all this sort of multiple percussion setup going on. And I mean, he literally looked like he was going to do like some sort of Steve Reich phase piece, sort of modern percussion piece. Yeah. And I was like, who on earth is that guy? And I kind of looked him up, and it was, early days of the internet, I suppose, it was 2001. And I somehow got a hold of Wilco's manager, Tony Margarita's email, because, I know what it was. There was an article about this drummer, Glenn Kochi, in Modern Drummer, and he talked about he was a teacher. So I go, well, I'll see if he wants to give me a drum lesson. He's a teacher. Sure. But I emailed the manager just thinking like, well, he just joined this band. and they just played on Conan, and they're clearly on tour, and maybe the manager in 6 months will email me back and tell me to go jump in the lake. But I fired this off. The next day, Glenn emailed me back, and he said, hey, I love teaching, man. I was like, where do you live? Like, we're on tour. And I told him I'm in Columbus, Ohio. And he was like, all right, well, we're playing in Columbus next week or whatever it was. So I went to the Wexner Performance Center, which is on the Ohio State University campus where Wilco was playing that next night, picked Glenn up in my truck, drove him to my rehearsal space in Columbus. And we had drum lessons. And I had a couple with him over the years. And he is a wonderful mentor and teacher and sort of influence on me.
What was the biggest takeaway from him, if not a million things? Approaching
the drum set as a multiple percussion instrument. And he was just, he did that thing. He does that drum set adaptation of the Balinese gamelan orchestra. That's this poem about the monkey chant and all that. And he's sort of tells this story through solo. It's interesting, we hear solo drums and we think Vinny at the Modern Drummer Festival, and that's cool. I love that stuff for sure. But Glenn's thing is like more like, no, dude, I'm going to one by one open these tiny boxes of chirping crickets, and then I've attached a contact mic to this tiny African marimba thumb piano thing, and then I'm going to fuzz out the whole drum set and play this wacky Steve Reich like phase piece. You know what I mean? And I was just, a total sucker for that stuff. There's a piece, I'll try to be quick about it, but there's a piece called Clapping Music that Steve Reich made famous, and it's in 3/4, and it's just this. So I'll count it out. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So that's the ostinato, right?
Okay.
Da 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 da. And every measure. So one of the clappers just does that again and again and again and again. The second clapper, every measure takes that figure and just goes and scoots it over 1 8 note, and then one more 8 note, and one more 8 note. And that's why it's called a phase piece, because slowly it starts in total unison, and then it just gets more and more wacky and dissonant and arrhythmic until after, I guess, 12 bars it would be, boom, we're back starting over again.
Okay.
And Glenn has like a drum set adaptation of that. So aside from just the aesthetic coolness of it as a composition, it's also just a really good independence exercise.
Yeah. I wish we could do it together, but there's a delay.
Yeah.
So if we actually tried it in unison, it would probably have some weird phase effect.
It would just sound like a mess.
Yeah, exactly.
Even when you nail it, it sounds like a mess. That's the crazy thing.
Oh, yeah, that's the point. Yeah, Glenn, especially on this record, all his choices are just the right choices, and everything sounds so different. Every song is its own little world, and I so appreciate that about records.
It's really that band's like Kid A, if that makes any sense. Because when Wilco started, their first couple of records, AM was total kind of like down the middle, kind of country roots rock, Stonesy, twangy, steel guitar, very much more in the wheelhouse of like what I grew up listening to, right? Which is why I gravitated to it, because then I'm like, I don't know, let's just get the new Wilco record. And they sort of slowly got weirder and weirder to the point by when Yankee Hotel came out, it was like, that took me several listens to be like, whoa, what is going on here? But the beauty of the mission statement of that record is just that, underneath it all, it's Jeff's songs, and Jeff's songs are beautiful, and they're vulnerable, and they're uninhibited, and they're really, really poignant, and they're very moving. But they're sort of like, okay, how can we take these songs that are little sort of like folk 1-4-5 dudes strumming on a acoustic guitar, dad guy, and just twist them and just make them really, really, at times borderline unlistenable. And they just really play around with just the sonics of what's going on in a way that was very, very, very inspiring and exciting to me as a young drummer.
Yeah, I also like how low in the mix a lot of those drums are. The younger me is like, just turn it up, crank it, know?
Yeah.
And the older I get, I'm like, I don't even want to hear the hi-hat. You can play it, but I swear to God, if I hear it...
Yeah, we don't need it.
Yeah.
Everybody gets it. Okay,
totally.
Okay.
Yeah. Jeez, I have the heaviest right hand. It's bad. All right, so next one is The National, and you kind of said, and I'll say what you said, basically any mid-2000s Brooklyn indie record, a la the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, TV on the Radio, Spoon, great band, and Grizzly Bear. But The National, the album Boxer, Brian Devendorf he's a god to me as well.
Yeah, me too. When about 2007, when that record came out, I was on tour with Ben Kweller a lot, with Chris Morrissey, and we had a tour manager. Our tour manager, Brandon Reed, was also the tour manager for the National. And that was just this one year in my life where I was probably 24 or however, 25. And we like went to Australia and Japan 3 times that year. And I have such visceral memories again of just waking up on an airplane, landing in Nagoya or something, and that record just blasting in my ears. And I was so inspired by it because Brian, very much in the school of a Stephen Morris from Joy Division or Alan Myers from Devo, is totally like a parts drummer. And it's very much coming out of like art school. And because funny enough, I got to know Brian because of that tour manager in common. Brian was super jazzed about the fact that I'd studied with Glenn, because Brian was obsessed with Glenn too. So then we used to just get together at my spot in Brooklyn and just play clapping music together. And it was just like, he was like cool. My Brooklyn drum nerd buddy. And they're from Ohio, and he's moved back to Ohio, but he's another guy who was very cool to me when I was younger and was very accessible. And we played drums together and stuff. And I model a lot of my approach after what he does, which is again, so Stephen Morris and Alan Myers, I don't know those guys super well, but like those guys literally were just, I think, coming at it from this sort of like art school composition element. Like, I don't think those guys were drumistic in any way, but what that did was they created these kind of wild, those guys or the guy in Oingo Boingo too, for that matter, like their default wasn't, my default is free falling or something. You know what I mean? Like, but those guys are like, so check out Devo playing Satisfaction. If you've ever heard that, the snare hits on one. And I was thinking about this today. It's like, if the Stones version of Satisfaction is the audio equivalent of like Sex, basically, the Devo version, it's like a photographic negative. It is the most like anti-sex. It's just a big brain. It's just a big, weird, twisted Ren and Stimpy brain doing this weird science thing or whatever. You know what I mean? But
Ren and Stimpy finally made the podcast. I'm so happy.
I had a bet with myself that I could drop that in.
We did it.
But it's very, very compositional based, and that's how Brian Chase from the Yeah Yeah Yeahs approaches his thing. And that guy was a jazz. I mean, he's a total Oberlin jazz drummer for sure. But there are like phrases and shapes and parts and themes that develop throughout the composition, and that's a big part of what's going on basically all of those records by the National and all of those records that I cited. And those records were also, there's a nostalgic element too, because all those records were really, really big when I was living in Brooklyn, but all those bands were in Brooklyn and were like around, and you could hang out with them and they were accessible.
100%. Yeah, Brian, and there's so many bands, and I'm not going to name all of them, but that I think about when it comes to this. But Brian is one of those drummers that band would be completely different if he wasn't the drummer.
And that's, my God, dude, that is the highest compliment that you could pay a drummer. Like,
absolutely.
If you take him out of that band, it's not that band.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's insane. I'm gonna ask you after we get off the air to intro him, because I've reached out to Brian a few times.
Sure,
but
sure.
He would be. I would love to dissect his brain when it comes to that.
Of course. Yeah, let's do it.
But yeah, so you said, or moving on the next one, actually, I'm going to play a little bit of, because I didn't play any Wilco, but I do want to play, I'll play Apartment Story, because that one's just kind of just driving.
Such a gorgeous song.
All right. So this is Apartment Story from Boxer, the National record.
I was closing my eyes when I was listening to that, because I just had that in my headphones on my like old school literal iPod, just wandering around Brooklyn hungover some afternoon, walking through Park Slope and being 25 without a care in the world. And boy, it was just such a happy moment in my life for sure.
That's awesome, man. All right. So the next one is a favorite drummer, the next prompt, which is the final one, unfortunately, but it's a favorite drummer and how the overall body of work has affected you. Okay. And we've kind of already talked about Glenn Cochi and Brian Devendorf.
Yeah.
But you have not mentioned Jim Eno.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
John from my band that's his favorite band in general. So
yeah.
Spoon is amazing. By the way, if I didn't mention that, it's he's the drummer for the band Spoon. But yeah, go ahead.
Big fan. So they were big in Austin, Texas in the mid-2000s. And Ben Kweller, who I played with during that period of time, moved from Brooklyn to Austin. So Chris and I would fly to Austin twice a month for a year, or the better part of a year. Then we made a record of Queller's at Spoon's studio that Jim owned. And, I kind of got to watch him set up drums and stuff. And that's another band where, it's like Jim is like the Lars of that band insofar as like he's very much a leader and sort of like an influencer and how things go. And he's a big, big, big part of that sound. And he probably doesn't have the headroom that a Brian Devendorf has, but he, like the common thread of all these guys that we're talking about is like, he just sounds like a really good musician who's playing drums.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It's not necessarily that's the Levon thing. That's definitely Brian Devendorf, Glenn Cochi. Like those guys are musicians, and somebody just happened to sit him down at a set of drums. And that's kind of what Jim has going on. And also there's his engineering abilities. And yeah, I mean, the Gimme Fiction record was big for me. Gaga 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 was really big for me. Transference was really big for me. They're just like they're like a recording band. There's something very stonery about it where, there's not a ton going on. In the mix, you know what I mean? So everything just pops so clearly. And if you are enough of a nerd as, maybe you or I are, you're just listening, you're like, oh, every 16th time he hits the floor tom, there's this weird spring reverb sound or whatever. Yep. Like, it's just some serious dad, like nerding out. Like they put some serious effort into some stuff that maybe, probably won't affect sales, so to speak. But I enjoy the sort of audio nuance to what's going on in their deal.
Well, see that, okay, now I'm going to go back to the beginning when I said the whole, like, not working on 6-stroke rolls. I wish that's the stuff that I would, like, if I had the CPU to practice that was, how can I practice making those decisions, like adding the every 16 bars, have this spring reverb thing go on the floor tom. That's what I wish I could physically practice. And the only way I can actually physically practice is to have a podcast where I invite some of the best drummers on to show me things that I need to listen to more.
Well, I think about that, Ben, what you're doing is so cool. It's like it's funny. Earlier you referred to, I forget what it was, but there was some point at which your mind was changed or whatever. And you were like, oh, it's not very common that somebody would just turn around. I'm embarrassed. You said, I'm a little embarrassed that I have, episodes out where I had a previous viewpoint and I've since maybe evolved it a little bit or whatever. But I hear that and I'm just sort of like, how cool is that you're kind of, now it's me talking to you, but it's like, you're like on this, I think if I'm understanding what's going on, it's like you're on this fun, like journey to like learn about some new music. And especially in the pandemic, I mean, what a great thing to do and what a great way to occupy your time and to like learn all this stuff, you know what I mean? And because it's not like, that's funny. You were sort of, I think you're being facetious when you're like, well, how do I practice learning all that kind of stuff? But it's just, I think the answer is you just kind of have to like be obsessed with music for like your whole life and just listen to it all the time. You know what I mean? There's not just like if you do this, then you'll know. I mean, you could just like put yourself in front of Sam Cooke's entire catalog, I guess, or whatever, you know what I mean? But like a lot of that, it seems like you put a really high premium on people who make really, really evolved musical choices. And and that's great. And I'm 100% with you. I am in that same camp. And I would just posit that I think those people arrived at that station or at that position in their careers because they just listened to a ton of music. I think Mark talked to you about this, like, you're going to be you. And that's the beauty of it. I'm not trying to be presumptuous and give you like a life coaching counseling session here, but it's cool that, if you're just, I'm a 35-year-old dude. I lived in Seattle. I went to wine school. I liked rock music. Now I like some other kind of music. I'm trying to work through it. I'm trying to make sense of it all. It's like, well, that's awesome. That's humanity, that's a beautiful thing. It's kind of cool. Honestly, it's kind of cool to see it because I mean, I've got everything figured out. I don't have anything to work on. So, it's nice to see somebody who's not fully formed like you.
No, it's beautiful. Just looking at, this angel in front of me.
Dude, joking, obviously, but it's like every day is a new thing. And that is, that's kind of the fun part of, the fancy media studies term is disintermediation. Just the fact that like there are no more gatekeepers and there are no more, used to be you'd have to go to the record store and the major label would put out the record, and now you can hear anything. Mm-hmm. You can, that's awesome. I mean, it's cool. It's, it's kind of just cliche to complain about technology and all that stuff, whatever. But like the fact that I can just in my hand have Sam Cooke's entire catalog within minutes, like, dude, I gotta say, like those kids coming up behind us. What's that LCD Sound System song about? I'm losing my edge. The kids are coming up behind us.
Yeah.
Dude, kids who have had access to YouTube for their like entire life, like, whoa, like young musicians, you know what I mean? Like those guys are bonkers. I didn't have that stuff. You know what I mean? I had VHS tapes and stuff. I'm now dad's complaining, but it's true,
No, I was talking to, now I'll humble brag, I had Richard Spavin on last week, and we were talking about that yes, there is that, it's all about perspective. It's harder now to really submerge yourself in a scene and a specific record because you have the ability to go, well, now I want to listen to this.
Yeah.
And so while that is a challenge, just because I have ADD, I think any drummer does in a certain way. But I also, if I had to choose to go back to that where it was easier to be obsessed with something, I would stay right here.
Yeah. Yeah. Although it's true, though, it's not even an ADD thing, but like it's true that like all those records that we've been talking about right now, for me personally, I've listened to those records hundreds of times, if not thousands in some cases. And I do wonder, maybe the silver lining for somebody in my generation is just that, like, I don't know if a 24-year-old kid is going to listen to the band record 1,000 times. You know what I mean? Like he'll probably check it out on his way to something else, on his way to check out Khruangbin, on his way to check out Tyler, the Creator or whatever. And that's all cool. But like, I did some deep dives and so did a lot of people. You did too. You know what I mean? Yeah. So that's not without its merit, let's just say.
Yeah. Well, Mark, those are your Big Fat Five. I'm so happy we got to chat, man. This has been a blast.
I wish I'd met you when you were back at Bedrock, man. That's because I was there. We probably passed each other in the hall a dozen times.
Well, I'm sure we did.
Yep.
We pulled the same little tag for a band audition, I'm sure. All right. Well, Mark, have a good day, man. And I'll probably see you very soon, man. So.
Yeah, rock on. Thank you so much for having me aboard. It was a real pleasure.
And that's the show. Be sure to subscribe. And if you're listening on a platform that allows for ratings or reviews, do that. It helps more people find the show, which means the show will get better and bigger, and hopefully I'll have a chance to sell out one day. But you'd be an OG listener that could brag to all your friends. Anyways, also, why don't you go ahead and check out bigfatsnaredrum.com and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and all the socials. Just search for @BigFatSnareDrum and you will find it. This show is edited in part using iZotope RX8 audio editor. It's amazing, so go check that out at iZotope.com. Bye.